And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's program, which is entitled The Mapping of the American Revolution Told in 10 Maps. This presentation was prepared by Ronald S. Gibbs, President, and Thomas Paper, Vice President of the California Map Society, and will be presented by Ronald. To celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, this presentation will explore the political and military aspects of the war using 10 period maps from the Gibbs family collection. At the outset, the Americans were given little chance to gain independence against the mighty British forces. Yet, underlying the British power, there were telling weaknesses. Ron will report what the key actions of the 8 years-long war were, and then analyze where the British lost and the Americans won. And now I turn the program over to Ron. He will address a few of your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat feature during and after the presentation. Okay.
Thank you, Ron. And while we're getting the slides up, I want to say how happy I am to make the presentation tonight. Good evening to those in the eastern part of the country. Good afternoon to those in the west. Our timing could not be better. We are in the midst of the 250th anniversary of American independence. And this weekend, the much heralded PBS Ken Burns special premieres. It is a 6-part, 12-hour presentation on the American Revolution. I'm going to be a little bit more succinct, and I will go through the 8 years of the American Revolution in 38 minutes. Jackie, can we get the slides up, please? Ready to share? Are we ready to share the slides?
You can share. There you go.
Okay, ready to go? We'll just make sure we can see these. Okay. Okay, they'll be coming up in just a second. I do want to say that of the 10 maps that we have, all of these are in the website, the free website called pixium.org. So you can explore these 10 maps to your heart's content. They are all very rich and wonderful maps. And the chat box has the link to them. The chat box also has my website, which has some additional information. So our timing is great, and our topic is very well placed. Next slide, please, Jackie. Today, most people around the world get their news from the cable, such as Cable News Network, featuring the venerable reporter Wolf Blitzer. If CNN were around 250 years ago, next slide, it might be called the Colonial News Network, featuring an ancestor of the venerable Wolf Blitzer. And if you're wondering why I chose Wolf Blitzer, it's because I thought he looked so distinguished. Next slide, please. And there we go. So now let's turn the clock back 250 years and go to the 18th century Situation Room. Next slide. And here in the Situation Room, loaded with papers and pens and books, we go to Ye Breaking News. Next slide. July 4th, 1776, 13 British colonies in North America declared independence from England, but the colonists, variously called rebels or patriots, have little chance, Wolf Blitzer's sources say. Well, the American Revolution was both a political and a military conflict. Forward-thinking Americans were raising new ideas in human thinking. They were proposing against the divine right of kings and against the power of parliament. They were arguing for representative government and a fair say in taxation. But for the political revolution to succeed, there first had to be victory on the battlefield. And it was clearly thought that the British had the upper hand. Next slide. England had a large professional army. It had undoubtedly the best navy in the world. They had veteran generals who were successful in wars on the continent and in North America just 10 years before, and they had deep resources. The colonists, on the other hand, really had no professional soldiers, experience only as militia. The commander-in-chief was relatively inexperienced and never had commanded a group of more than 800 men a regiment. There were a few borrowed officers from the British Army, but relatively few experienced officers, and they had really no way of gathering central resources, for Congress was relatively impotent in its taxation policy. Next slide. I promised you 10 maps, and the first of these is of the British dominions. This is the Laurie and Whittle map, published 10 years after the American Revolution, but I chose it because it accurately shows the theater of the war. Next slide, please. The American Revolution took place over 1,300 miles, from in Canada, up in the north part, down to Georgia. North America at the time of the American Revolution was largely wilderness, with few roads. The population of the British colonies was about 3 million, a sixth of whom were enslaved persons. And North America was very different from Northern Europe. The fighting season, the summers were hot and muggy, and there were new conditions to deal with, conditions of disease, particularly malaria. Further, transportation was by foot or horsepower or by boat, and armies moved ploddingly slow, only 10 or 15 miles a day. New York and Philadelphia, the two largest cities in British North America, were 3,600 statute miles from London, and in the days of sail, it would take 4 to 6 weeks to get a dispatch across the Atlantic. Most of the war took place on a thin stripe within 50 or 100 miles of the Atlantic coast, and geography dictated the tactics. Next slide. The next map that I'm going to show you is of Boston and its environs. And this comes from Chief Justice John Marshall's atlas to his book, his 5-volume book called The Life of Washington. This atlas was published in 1832, and I'm going to show you about 4 maps from this atlas because they have unusual degrees of scope and detail. And I'm very pleased to tell you that in the current issue of Portalin, Tom Paper and I have an article about all 10 maps in Marshall's atlas. Next slide, please. So to orient you to this map, Jackie, could we add the dots at this point? Dot number 1 is of Boston, which was a peninsula at the time, connected to the mainland by a thin neck. There is Boston Harbor with many of its islands, and then the surrounding countryside of Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Could you go into full screen mode, please?
Jackie, can you go to full screen mode? Yeah, okay, there we go. Now, what you'll be able to do is zoom in and zoom out, but Boston was the hotbed of political thinking. And after the Boston Tea Party, which occurred in December 1773, England quartered troops in Boston. This was after about 10 years of political struggle. Now, I want to next take you in the upper left to dot number 2. That is the road to Lexington and Concord just off this map. On April the 19th, 1775, the American Revolutionary War begins with the shot heard around the world in the villages of Lexington and Concord. The British sent a column of about 700 men from Boston to achieve two purposes: capture John Hancock and Sam Adams and destroy a cache of colonial arms. They were not able to be successful in either of those. The Massachusetts militia gathered round, and in the retreat of 19 miles from Concord, the British column was attacked and was in danger of being annihilated. So it then followed in April that the British hunkered down in Boston with the Massachusetts militia surrounding them. 2 months later, on June 17, 1775, the British awoke to find that at dot number 3 on the Charlestown Peninsula, the Americans had fortified a position coming down in history of Bunker Hill, but it was actually Breed's Hill. And from this point, American cannon fire threatened the British. The British were not able to put up with this. They formed up their troops, and they sent thousands of British troops to dislodge the Americans. It took 3 assaults of the British to successfully capture Bunker Hill, but it was at great cost to the British. That was June 1775. 2 weeks later, George Washington arrives as commander of the Americans, and stalemate ensues during the winter. But in March, at dot number 4, George Washington takes advantage of a British oversight, and he fortifies Dorchester Heights. From here, American cannon fire again threatened the British, and the British are forced to leave Boston. They and thousands of loyalists sail off Nova Scotia, not to give up the war, but with the idea of coming back. That we will take up in just another couple of slides. Now, to give you a real life feel, I want to show you a series of photographs and paintings. So let's go to the next slide. This is Old North Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts, seen from the view of where the British regulars were, and across the Concord River in the hills in the distance, the Massachusetts militia were forming, and they were coming to charge the bridge and force the British to retreat to Boston. The next slide is of the very famous statue of the Minuteman from 1775. Many of the heroic moments of the American Revolution are immortalized in a series of paintings. And the next slide is John Trumbull's painting of the death of Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Joseph Warren, in civilian life, was a very prominent physician in Boston, but he was also a very active political leader. And on June 17, 1775, decided he was not going to fight disease, but he was going to fight the British. And he was a major general inside the American fortifications at Bunker Hill. He refused to retreat. He was stabbed, he was knocked down, and this is the immortalization of Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the early martyrs of the American Revolution. Next slide, please.
25 minutes.
Now, the next slide is also from Marshall's Atlas, and this is the Northern Campaign in Northern New England and Canada in 1775, 1776. Next slide, please. We should go to full screen here also, Jackie, and we'll put the dots on. Can we go to full screen? So at the very top is Canada. To the lower left is Upper New York State, and to the right is New Hampshire. In September 1775, a band of about 1,300 Americans left Boston on a heroic expedition to Canada, thinking that the Canadians would join the revolution and become the 14th state. So they sailed from Boston to dot number 1 on the Maine coast, and they sailed up the Kennebec River. They crossed over a height of land at dot number 2 through 300 miles of Maine and Canadian wilderness. They faced wintry weather, smallpox, and starvation, but 6 weeks later came out at dot number 3, just before the town of Quebec, the walled town of Quebec. There they were joined by another American column which had just successfully taken Montreal. In a blinding snowstorm in late December of 1775, the Americans attacked the citadel of Quebec, but were repulsed, and they had great loss. The American leader of the attack was severely wounded. He lived to play a heroic role 2 years later at Saratoga, and then became one of the most infamous characters in American history. Next slide. Next slide. And here is that American hero turned traitor from Connecticut, a bold battlefield leader, but he also felt overlooked and underappreciated, and his name is none other than Benedict Arnold, a household name for traitor. Undaunted, under Arnold's command, he was still a hero at the time, the Americans laid siege to the British and Canadians inside the walled city of Quebec. But in the spring in 1776, a relief force sailed up the St. Lawrence River, forcing the withered Americans to retreat to New York, and the whole effort to conquer Canada was a complete failure. Next slide. We now turn to 1776, and this is the William Faden map of the New York Theater of Operations. William Faden was a premier cartographer and held the title of cartographer to the king. Let's go to the next map, please, Jackie. And we'll put on the dots, and we will need to go to full screen here. Running down the center of the map, can we go to full screen, please? Rolling down the center is at the bottom, lower New York Bay, and then the Hudson River. So the British were forced to evacuate Boston in March 1776. They went off to Nova Scotia to rest and refit. But then they were not about to give up, and the British target was going to be New York City. New York City for 3 reasons. First of all, it had a large loyalist population. Second of all, it had this network of waterways, which would give the Royal Navy control and give the British the initiative. And third, by capturing New York, the British felt they could separate the hotbed New England colonies from the middle colonies. The British had the largest force ever seen until that time in North America, 30,000 soldiers and sailors, and they landed to the lower left at Staten Island to rest in late July. After recuperating and shown in dot number 1, the British crossed lower New York Bay to western Long Island at a place today still called Gravesend Bay. At dot number 2, there was a large American force of about 10,000 men defending Brooklyn. The British handily defeated the Americans and came within a whisper of capturing all 10,000. But the British delayed and allowed the American army to retreat to Manhattan Island across the East River at dot number 3. 2 weeks later, the British did attack the Americans at dot number 3. This was a lightly defended point in the middle of Manhattan, today's 34th Street. It was then called Gibbs Bay, and today still called Gibbs Bay. The British onslaught came, the defending militia panicked, and the British came on and again had a chance of trapping half the American army in lower Manhattan, but the British delayed and the American army was able to consolidate in northern Manhattan. At dot number 4, at the upper part, we see that in late October, George Washington was about to be outflanked, and he evacuated Manhattan to make a stand 20 miles north in White Plains. In late October, he did battle with the British. It was basically a standoff, but the Americans wound up retreating from the battlefield. Washington's army then began its retreat across New Jersey, and that story we'll pick up on the next map. But before we leave, we have to go to dot number 5. Dot number 5 is at an area in Manhattan still called Fort Washington, and Washington faithfully left an unsupported fort named in his honor in northern Manhattan. The British returned from White Plains and in early November attacked the fort, and this turned out to be the greatest disaster in the North for the Americans. 5,000 men were captured after a battle of just a couple of hours and irreplaceable materiel. Washington made his way all the way across the 60 miles of New Jersey, closely pursued by the British, and escaped to temporary safety across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. This was his darkest hour, and he said, "I feel the game is pretty well up." Let's go to the next slide. And this is for a bit of a color photograph. So if you were a raw Connecticut militiaman in September 1776, and you were peering out at the East River into the foggy conditions, you would be looking out at a giant flotilla of British warships crammed with men coming at you. And after taking a few cannon shots from the British warships from the mighty Royal Navy, you and your mates would do exactly what the raw militia did on that September morning, and you would run like hell. And they ran like hell up to consolidate in Heights. Next slide. Well, the next map is actually my favorite map. This is the William Thaden map published in 1777 of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So now Washington, next slide, please. So we should go put the dots on, and we want to go to full screen. And here you see running down the left side, let's go to full screen, the course of the Delaware River. So to the left is Pennsylvania, to the right is New Jersey. With George Washington's options very limited, with his back to the wall, with the cause of independence on the line, he decides to take a very risky gamble and he goes on the attack. At dot number 1, on Christmas night, 1776, he crosses the Delaware. And why does he cross the Delaware? Because his intelligence has informed him that at dot number 2, 8 miles away, there is an isolated force of about 1,400 German mercenaries allied with the British. These are the Hessians. So Washington crosses the Delaware, marches to Trenton, and at dot number 2 has a very quick and very lopsided victory with nearly all of the 1,400 Hessians either killed or captured. 10 days later, Washington has another victory at dot number 3 at Princeton, where he defeats a number of British regular regiments. These two battles, Trenton, December 26, 1776, Princeton, January 3rd, 1777, turn the course of the war, and the cause of independence, which had been on death's door, is saved. This was a bold but successful maneuver. Next slide. Let's pull this up to full screen. This is probably the most beloved historic painting in American history. It is Emanuel Leutz's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, painted 75 years after the crossing. It is loaded with historic error, but it still is beloved because it depicts the bold, risky, and heroic moments. Next slide. Leutz's painting depicts George Washington
We
in a
temporarily
rowboat.
lost your slides. Here she comes.
They were, Jackie, are we ready to bring that back up?
It's visible, Dr. Gibbs.
Not on our screens.
Let's see.
It's visible.
No, not to us. We don't see it.
Hit share screen again. Now we see
There we
it.
go. There we go.
Oh, okay, hold on here. I just,
You had
one
it.
sec. Yeah.
Good. So Leutz's painting depicts Washington in a rowboat, but in fact, the boats that he used to cross the Delaware are shown here in a replica, and these were actually much larger affairs which had been used for shipping coal and other goods up and down the river. This is from a reenactment of Washington crossing the Delaware. Now, the next slide is from the Museum of the American Revolution. This is a diorama showing the American forces moving into position in their attack, their successful and very quick successful victory at Trenton. And if you haven't been to the Museum of the American Revolution, I definitely recommend that you make the trip. Next slide, please. Now, while this was going on around New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, there was a separate theater of the war in Charleston, South Carolina. The British sent a seaborne expedition in the summer of 1776 to capture Charleston, the largest city in the American South. Next slide. And we'll go to full screen and put on the dots. So Charleston is pictured there at dot number 1 on the peninsula between the Ashley and the Cooper Rivers. Let's put the dots up, please. Thank you. The British thought they could capture Charleston, where they expected to get support from a large number of loyalists. But the South Carolina militia was ready for the seaborne expedition, and at dots number 2 and number 3, they constructed 2 forts guarding the entrance to the harbor. The British fleet sailed into Charleston Harbor, and shown at dot number 4, many of their ships ran aground on the shallow waterway and became easy targets for the American artillery in the fortress. The vaunted Royal Navy, the greatest navy in the world, had to retreat from Charleston, its tail between its legs. And this American victory held the American South until the British returned 4 years later. Next slide. Now I'm going to show you a map of Philadelphia by William Faden. This is actually the Matthew Lotter German version in 1777. Next slide. So here is Philadelphia, shown in the red matrix in the center. Dots, please. It was situated between the Delaware River at dot number 1 and the Schuylkill River at dot number 2. Philadelphia had a population of 30,000, the largest city in British North America. It was a center of government, a center of science, a center of medicine, and a center of commerce and culture. Dot number 3 is the Pennsylvania State House, an elevation of that. This was the Pennsylvania State House, and here on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was announced, and henceforth this has been known as Independence Hall. Now, let's go to dot number 4, and dot number 4 is of minor historic significance because that is the site of my boyhood home in Philadelphia. So in 1777, the British have a two-pronged attack to end the American Revolution. The main British army is going to attack Philadelphia from New York, and then in upstate New York, another British army is going to be coming down from Canada. But now let's focus on the campaign for Philadelphia and go to the next slide. So this map again is from Marshall's Atlas and shows in detail the Philadelphia campaign. Next slide, we'll put the, so we see coursing down here, the Delaware River, Pennsylvania is to the left, New Jersey is to the right. At dot number 1 shows Head of Elk, Maryland, not very far from where most of you are situated right now. And for still unexplained reasons, the British took a circuitous sea route and went out into the Atlantic from New York, came around the Chesapeake Capes, and landed at the northern tip of Chesapeake Bay at Head of Elk, Maryland. When they landed there, they were still 65 miles from Philadelphia, which is at dot number 2. In other words, they were only 35 miles closer to Philadelphia than they were when they left New York about a month before. George Washington now has to defend Philadelphia, and he makes his defense at dot number 3 on the Brandywine River, about 30 miles south and west of Philadelphia. He makes his defense at a place called Chad's Ford. On September the 11th, the British mount an attack on George Washington, completely outmaneuver him, and it is a rout. the entire American army is saved from disaster only by their ability to mount a successful rear guard maneuver. 2 weeks later, the British march into the American capital without firing a shot. But capturing the American capital did not end the war, and George Washington is not done. At dot number 4, about 2 weeks later, he decides to attack the main German outpost at Germantown, just about 10 miles north of Philadelphia. His attack begins well, but it's too complicated. There's great fog. His attack unravels. It gives the British a chance to rally, and Washington winds up retreating. Maneuvering occurs for several more weeks, and then Washington's bedraggled army goes into winter encampment at dot number 5 for the heroic encampment at Valley Forge for the winter of 1777-1778. Next slide. This is what the British would have seen as they approached the Brandywine River. This is from the south side. The Americans would have been on the north. And as you can see, Brandywine River was not much of an affair. It was not very wide, nor was it very deep, and was fordable in several positions. The next slide shows a modern view of Independence Hall, where the Declaration was signed and was the center of the Congressional Congress. Next slide. Here is another of the heroic paintings. This is by William Trigo, a painting not made until about 100 years after the American Revolution, but it shows the beaten, haggard army of George Washington, 12,000 strong, moving into the encampment at Valley Forge. Valley Forge was 19 miles outside Philadelphia. It had just a few homes. The officers moved into those, and the men lived in tents for the first few weeks. And next slide, built a series of huts. These were drafty, these were cold, these were crowded and disease infested, and the men had to deal with pneumonia, smallpox, typhus, and other conditions. But coming out of this encampment was a much better army, a very well drilled army. And the next spring, the British evacuated Philadelphia to consolidate in New York, fearful of a French attack. The whole effort in Philadelphia was for naught. Next slide. So while that was going on in Philadelphia, we must now turn to the Northern Campaign of 1777. Next slide. And now we will return to the map that we've seen before, but now we will focus on the left-hand side, going down through Lake Champlain and Lake George and to the Hudson River. So while the main British army was occupied in Philadelphia, another British army of about 7,000 Canadians and British with some Native American allies leaves Canada at point number 1 and starts their attack, their invasion of New York. This is an army under General Burgoyne. But now the British have one army 500 miles away from Howe's army, and this leads to their undoing. The two armies cannot support each other, and the British, it turns out, are going to suffer from problems of distance, time, disorganization, and ignorance of the conditions in North America. Initially, the British invasion is successful, and at dot number 2, by early July, they capture Fort Ticonderoga between Lake Champlain and Lake George. But now a huge American army, not under George Washington, but under General Gates, is gathering. And they meet the British army At Saratoga Springs, they have the British outnumbered about 3-1. And after 2 battles, one in mid-September and one in October, the British are trapped, and an entire British army of 7,000 surrenders. This is at Saratoga. This is the first British disaster of the war. It is a telling victory because following this, the French alliance begins. The French are age-old enemies of the British. 10 years before this, the British have lost their colonies during the French and Indian War, and now the French are seeking revenge. They are thirsty for revenge. Next slide. So now we go for some further breaking news. Next slide. And we see that October 17th, 1777, with no possibility of escape, British General Burgoyne surrenders his army of 7,000 men at Saratoga Springs to the American army under General Gates. And French King Louis XVI not only takes note, but begins negotiations to become formal allies. Next slide. And this great moment of the surrender of Burgoyne's army is depicted in this John Trumbull painting. Next slide. Now we're going to return to the American South and wrap up the war. We've seen this map of Charleston before, and for strategic reasons, the British have consolidated in New York, and now they turn the war to the South, hoping to take advantage of Loyalist support. They have a victory in taking Savannah in late 1779, and in the spring of 1780, next slide, they come back to Charleston. Let's go to we're on full screen. Recall full screen. Notice that, remember that the British tried to take Charleston in 1776, but were repulsed. Now they come in with greater force. They lay siege to Charleston, and in May of 1780 achieved the greatest defeat of the Americans of the war. 5,000 Americans, 5,500 surrender as Charleston is captured. Following that, George Washington sends his favorite general, Nathaniel Greene, into the South to lead an army, and he and the British commander in the South, General Cornwallis, are like two boxers over the next year and a half. There are several battles. The Americans often lose the battlefield, but the army remains intact, and the British are not able to replace their losses. So next slide. Next slide, we will go to the map of Yorktown published by Condor in 1788. And I will orient you to this map. At the top is the York River, and at dot number 1 is the village of Yorktown. So in September 1781, the British have come into the sleepy town of Yorktown to refit and to be relieved and resupplied by the Royal Navy. But now the French fleet is in American waters, and at dot number 2, the French fleet gets into York Bay ahead of the French fleet, beats back the French fleet and beats back the British fleet, and the French fleet drives off the British fleet. Now an entire British army is in Yorktown. It's trapped, it's isolated with no support. George Washington and his French allies march from New York to Yorktown and lay siege to the British. Dot number 3 shows the French siege position initially, and dot number 4, the American siege lines. The British have no hope of getting help. They are suffering from bombardment from the American and French artillery, and they too surrender. They surrender in October 1781. This is the second entire British army to surrender. And after this, the British government and the British people have no more stomach for war. Negotiations ensue. And next slide, we show the John Trumbull painting of the surrender of the British at Yorktown. Negotiations ensue. Next slide, please. Negotiations ensue in Paris. Next slide, please, Jackie. Negotiations ensue in Paris. And the last map that I'm going to show you has been called the most important map in American history. The original map was made by Dr. Mitchell, the only map he ever did in 1756. And this is the French version of the map. Next slide. So this map is exquisite in detail, and I invite you to look at it in detail on the Pixium website. It has every river, every village, every city, and this was so detailed that it was used to determine the boundaries of the new United States. So now let's go for our final bit of breaking news on the next slide. And the treaty is signed in Paris, and now CNN says, as we predicted in 1776, England's 13 North American colonies win independence and the American Revolutionary War formally ends. Next slide. So why is it that the British, with all their advantages at the beginning, lost and the Americans won? Well, the British had the wrong strategy and they had the wrong generals. They had burdensome logistics. Every cannonball, every horse, most of their food had to be transported from England. And the British, as we noted, were hindered by poor decision-making, worsened by the problems of time and distance. The Americans had a cause, and they had the right leader. The Americans lost many battles, but they eventually had the right strategy. The strategy was not necessarily winning, but not losing, and the Franco-American alliance was critical. So next slide. I do want to close by this portrait of George Washington, the Olympian figure of early American history, not a great tactician initially, but he kept his eye on the prize and he realized what he had to do to win. Now, then I'm going to give an unabashed plug, next slide, for some holiday reading for you, if you like. I have I've written 2 historical novels, both set during the American Revolution. This one I published last year. It's called The Rogue's Plot, the untold story of 1777, and asks, what if a rogue British officer decides to end the American Revolution by bringing germ warfare against George Washington's army through smallpox? And then the other slide that I want to show is the first novel that I wrote in 2020 called The Long Shot. And this asks, what if the unthinkable happened? What if during the early precarious days of the American Revolution, George Washington gets shot? So at that point, I want to go to wrap up, go to the last slide where I have my website and acknowledge the help that I've gotten in preparing this and be happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks very much for your great attention. Happy Thanksgiving to all.
Hey, Ron, thanks for that, what I consider to be an excellent summary of the war and the integration of the maps and the paintings. It just, to me, it turned out to be a good visual summary of the campaign. So thanks very much. Let's see if we have questions.
Okay, there is a question about the maps. Um, we do have the linkage to the website on Pixium. And again, I want to recommend that you make that visit. It is a free website, and Tom has done a great job of that. And if you happen to watch the PBS show, you'll have it enriched by looking at the maps as well.
Here's one question from Kenneth Habib. Why did the British take the long way to get to Brandywine Creek and Chadds Ford? Did their maps fail, or were they missing a good map of that area?
Well, good, Ken. Well, it is a debate as to why the British took that long sea route. They lost an entire month of fighting while they were out to sea. And it would have been probably easier for them just to come across New Jersey. New Jersey was flat. They had some rivers to cross, but the British had engineers, and they would have been in Philadelphia in 10 days rather than the long time that it took. The British General Howe was worried if he marched through New Jersey, whether his flanks might have been compromised, and he wound up taking the sea route. It was in retrospect a bad decision on his part, but that's a great question that historians have been dealing with.
Sarah Robinson asks, at what point did George Washington have his soldiers vaccinated for smallpox?
Ah, very good. Well, George Washington struggled with the initial of inoculation. And at the beginning of the war, he was having officers punished if they did the inoculation. But in February 1777, he did a turnabout and he ordered full-scale inoculation. This was not vaccination, this was inoculation, where live smallpox would be placed in the inoculee. It had a mortality of about 1 or 2%, but that was much better than the mortality of the natural infection, which was 15 to 30%. Vaccination actually came along in 1796 in England, and that used cowpox, was much safer and much more effective. But the whole struggle with smallpox is a major one, and I'm now working on a new book called The 1776 Medicine and War. It is a non-fiction history of medicine in the American Revolution, and well, it's a good companion to the two novels.
Okay. John Doctor asks, John Trumbull's painting of surrender at Yorktown showed an American flag with stars in an unusual format. Was that a legal flag at one time?
Well, good eye, John. I don't know that we can get back to it, but the painters did not feel obligated to make everything historically accurate. That's probably my best answer.
Okay. Tim Weiskell, do you have any maps that illustrate the arrival of cannons from Canada by the Green Mountain Boys in Boston?
I don't have that in the maps, but this was Henry Knox's heroic expedition, bringing a large number of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston to achieve the success in getting the British to evacuate in March of 1776. Great question.
I must say, I remember one map of, I guess, sort of southern New England that shows, I think it's called the Seat of War in New England. It shows the cannons being taken along one of the routes to Boston.
Yeah, Henry Knox, a Boston bookseller, became the chief artillery officer, and he carried out an epic expedition to bring the cannon on sledges through the winter. It was, I think, 300 miles.
Okay. Al Roca. I wonder if the British were at a disadvantage at the start of the war due to a lack of good maps, especially of the interior.
There were a number of maps of the cities. I was just talking with Dan. They had a series of maps that was called the American Pocket Atlas, but these were a pretty large scale and covered whole areas. So individual maps with good details such as roads, those would limit both armies. But the British did have loyalists, and the loyalists were able to survey and reconnoiter for them.
Karen Pinto just comments, excellent choice of paintings to go with the maps.
Thank you.
I think she made another comment earlier on, would be George Washington be turning over in his grave these days? But I guess you don't have to
Well,
answer
let's
that
see.
one.
If someone wants to get a drink, we'll get into political discussion, but probably not now.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions.
Ron, I'm showing you the map, the Timbal Atlas artwork right now. You can see the.
Oh, there we go. Oh, great. Thank you, John. Good eye. You know, I don't recall that configuration of the stars. Do you?
No, I've never seen one like that.
Yeah, well, I guess John Trumbull was playing a game with us.
Okay.
We'll give him painterly flexibility.
Okay, well, Ron, I'd like to thank you for this presentation. As I will tell you, I usually watch the numbers during the presentation, and we were over 100 attendees throughout the presentation. So this is probably one of our best. Okay, we've had several well-attended presentations lately, but I think this tops them. So thank you very much.
Great pleasure, and I hope everybody enjoys the 250th, and tune in to PBS and check out Ken Burns.
Terrific. Terrific.
Thank you.
Okay, now I guess we can stay on for a few minutes if there's any sort of socializing that people would like to do.
Okay. I'm going to sign off. I have to catch a train.